Welcome back to Energyscapes, Ocean and Space. A person I wanted to have a discussion about that has a really important role since before, during and after World War II, up into the 1970s or so, is this man that I've mentioned in other books, Victor Schauberger. Now, a book has been written here by Jane Cobbold, A Life of Learning from Nature. And then we've also got Living Water here, written by Olaf Alexanderson, who's also an interesting person and actually knew Victor Schauberger. And I have a document here I want to read from, The Burial of Living Technology, because I think it's important that everyone understands a bit about who this man was and what his contribution was to the flying discs, flying saucers, or UFO technology development, as we're calling it now. So I'm going to read some notes here from The Burial of Living Technology by John Manning. So originally Adolf Hitler forced this Austrian inventor into demonstrating that he could build these flying craft or flying discs that didn't burn any fossil fuels. And they used a unique suction turbine engine that based on implosion principles using water and air to create the force. Of course, the Third Reich wanted all this technology developed as quickly as possible to keep the war machine going and relieve the pressure on the demand for fossil fuels, especially towards the end of the war. So now Schauberger had no patience for greed-motivated fools, so he was a big burly man and quite difficult to deal with. And he was a forestry worker, of course, and was well versed in the laws of nature and what goes on in nature, and especially how water forms and what water does and how water can be used. And of course, he often looked or observed at what cold water does in the natural environment, as it has an inward spiraling movement, and he liked to copy this in his own engineering, or copy the principles of nature in some of his engineering principles for things like developing log fumes, of course. So he lived for years in a vast, relatively unspoiled forest, and after the First World War was in charge of 21,000 hectares of virgin forest in a very remote area. So he had lots of time to observe the rhythms of nature and life. And he was once looking at a lake and watched half-submerged logs out in the middle of it form into a whirlpool. And they all went in together down into this whirlpool, and then after it settled, a huge water spout came up out of there, and that made him think about, apparently that made him think about how water and the forces of nature develop an inward spiraling motion that generates all this energy. So his family's got a long history of association with forestry and wildlife care. His father was also a master woodsman, all right. So, and when he'd often go out at night and look at irrigation canals, okay, and look at how they moved or didn't move, and he looked at natural waterways which really flowed straight, of course, and they swerved from side to side, and he watched how water coiled and twisted around a central axis as it swept downstream in an inward spiraling motion. And he also looked at trout. So he would often observe trout in streams and how they stayed motionless in quite strong currents. And he observed that the water was really cold when they did this. So he did an experiment one day where he boiled some water on a burnt fire upstream, 500 upstream, and poured it all in the water. There was no overall difference in the water coming downstream, but the person observing the trout, as that water flowing through, the temperature differential, the trout could no longer stay motionless, holding itself against the stream. And he's also observed trout going up waterfalls and swim round and round and round in a vigorous spiraling motion, then get in the waterfall stream and be able to easily float up it to the next level. So, and he observed all that and started thinking about how and why that actually happens. and he looked at how density differences in water, just the tiniest amount, can have a big impact on electron spin or what's going on with the polarization of water in these vortices, of course. And to carry on from there, so he did all that, and then I think we came along. He was hired by a building contractor in 1934 to look at construction of log flumes, using some of his knowledge about keeping log flumes going and not jamming them up, by looking at how the swerving rivers and the spiraling inward direction of waterways stopped log flumes from jamming up. So he was hired to do that. And then he goes on to having bitter battles with the scientific community, of course, because he didn't have a formal qualification like a PhD. So he was always battling the sheepskins or the ones who hold degrees and their way, or their narrow-minded science of consensus way of thinking, which can stop innovation and free thinking and creativity and the development of new things. Now, when World War II came along, of course, Hitler heard of this man, Victor Schauberger, and wanted to get hold of him. So what happened from there is that once Hitler had heard of him, he was approached to look at developing or using his technology to develop some of these craft or discs that used his implosion technology. So, and that was about 1943, I think. And after a brief stint as a commander of a parachute group in Italy, he was ordered by Himmler to a concentration camp and threatened with death unless he developed these machines using the energy that he had discovered. So he based all that based on his what he'd been looking at with his observations in the forest of cold water and what happens to motion of vortices and axial or radial motion at falling temperatures in cold water. Now, this flying project was to be powered with this Trout-inspired turbine using an oscillation that resulted in the build-up of immense power that caused levitation in his craft that he designed. And he developed a small model which crashed when it smashed against a ceiling in a warehouse, and it glowed blue-green as it rose, and then trailed a silvery glow as well. So if you think of the UFO observations you see now, doesn't that sound quite familiar? Okay, so by the end of the war, American officers had showed up as well a few days after the model that he built hit the ceiling, and they seemed to know what he was doing. They seized all his work, it's got here, and interrogated him about his research, and he was held for nearly a year because of his knowledge. And it was only, so it was in July 27, 1956, there was a Munich publication that mentioned the first unmanned flying disc that was tested in February 19th, 1945 near Prague. The German periodical noted the flying disc had a diameter of 50 meters. Now, Victor Schauberger wrote to a friend in 1958 about a craft that was test flying near Prague, and according to the model he made at the concentration camp, it rose 15,000 meters into the air in 3 minutes and flew horizontally at 2,200 kilometers per hour. So, of course, by the end of the Second World War, the Russian military confiscated all his work and his models and diagrams, materials, and it's said here in this document that the Russians even burned his apartment in case they'd missed any technology secrets. So you've got the Americans and the Russians trying to get hold of him. Now, remember, we're going into the Cold War here, and the demand to get hold of some of these scientists and these work and take it out into the corporate world through the military-industrial complex was quite high, because they did not want the Russians to get hold of this work. So this was quite a history. There's no right or wrong in this. It's just the way it happened, and what we see now is the legacy of that. So it's not right or wrong. This is just how it was, and we need to understand this if we are to move forward at all with this whole UFO thing, which isn't really unidentified. It's just the public has no idea what's really been going on for the last 70, 80, 90, 100 years. So if I go from there, I'm nearly finished here because I don't want to go too long on this, just a couple more things to talk about. So we know that Victor Schauberger took a trip to America in 1958 when two men who apparently were American agents visited him and convinced him to go to America for about 3 months to Texas, and he was 73 years old at that time. So he brought all his documents and devices with him to Texas rather innocently, and was asked to write down everything he knew, of course, and then he cooperated, and all that material was sent to an atomic technology expert who met with the Schaubergers because he had his brother with him for 3 days. Now, according to the guy Olaf Alexanderson, who was an expert from New York, he said the path which Mr. Schauberger in his treatise and with his models has followed is the biotechnical path of the future. What Schauberger proposes and asserts is correct. In 4 years, all this will be confirmed. Now, he's the guy that wrote Living Water, all right? So what he's saying is that these UFOs or flying discs will work using his technology, and we will sort it out within the next 4 years. So 1958, 1959, 1960, so that's 1962. He reckons they will have control or complete control of the flight characteristics of these discs that use implosion and don't use fossil fuels. Now, he was eventually allowed to fly home after he signed a contract, which was in English, and he couldn't read English, but his brother did. So that was unfortunate for him, because his brother said when he got on the plane, you know what you've just done? You've signed all your rights away to continuing any work of this on your own, and you are no longer able to do it. So that's what happened, and he went home and was no longer involved in it. So I'll leave it at that for now, but I just wanted to tell that story briefly and recommend people read these 2 books on Victor Schauberger and just realise that this man, Olaf Alexanderson, actually acknowledged that what Victor Schauberger had developed was highly plausible and would work, and it would be proven in 4 years. And that is a UFO that doesn't use fossil fuels and exhibits the characteristics, the very characteristics that are reported now in sightings of discs or UAPs or unidentified flying objects. So get on the comments, see what you think, and we will talk soon.